Here to honor Jack's legacy of transformative learning. I'm going to share a little bit about where it started with the Women's Reentry Study Program, where he first wrote about and thought about transformative learning. And then Ted Fleming, who is not only studied with him, but he also has advanced this work in Europe with the successor to Jürgen Habermas, whose name is Axel Honneth at Columbia University, in the use of recognition theory in interpreting and thinking about transformative learning. So he will be next. And then Ellie, who does a lot of work in transformation theory, in constructive developmental learning and change, will talk a little bit about how Jack's work in constructive developmental learning is different, how they differ from one another and how they are like to one another. Followed by Lyle, who is in some ways expanding the thinking of Jack's by moving to an additional framework in which he looks more holistically at the affective and social dimensions of learning. Then Jeannie Bitterman is going to begin sharing a little bit about how many of our students have used these ideas in their own research and practice, and highlight some of what they've done through a Communities of Practice course that we have. And then our two graduates of our program, Gwendolyn Kaltoft and Rachel Sapor. And Gwendolyn's going to be speaking a bit about transformative learning theory in the hospice and end-of-life environment, and Rachel in the executive and managerial area. I can't help but brag that Rachel received a dissertation award for her wonderful dissertation on this topic. So that's the itinerary. This is the little book that you see on the screen, and this is the book that the Center for Adult Education published on the study of reentry women in community colleges, in which Jack developed his ideas about prospective transformation, or began to develop his ideas. And he was inspired in this work by his wife, Edie. So we always think of Jack and Edie as a pair. They really were a pair in many, many ways. And Edie, when she went back to school, was going through the kinds of things that Jack looked at and said, oh my goodness, this is very much like perspective transformation, using those ideas as developed from the current thinking at the time in both Paulo Freire around conscientization, as well as in women's consciousness raising. And Jack was very kind of intuitively linked to the idea that these community colleges are doing something amazing and we ought to study them. And so he got a grant from the Department of Education to study what these college programs looked like and how it is they supported women's development and change. So he really set out in some ways to look at curricular matters. How does a college actually embody and support this kind of change? But I think what's enduring and what people really remember is this idea of perspective transformation in individuals. And so I want to share with you a few highlights from that book, and also some perspectives that I bring, because I was a doctoral student at the time at the University of California in Berkeley. And so I had the privilege of really doing a lot of the data collection in the California schools. And at the time, I was studying with Barney Glaser grounded theory for a couple of years, and that was what the approach was that they were using in the study. So I was able to use that as my field project for my classes, et cetera, and made some contributions to this little book, which I found when I was recently going through his books and papers, which I now have, and we hope we'll be able to make them available to people once we figure out what we actually have. But I did find some of the interviews from this study, and I found some of the work that I had done on the California piece. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit of that. And I think it helps illuminate some of both the strengths and also the challenges that people sometimes find in Jack's work. So you have to go back to the 1970s. Some of you weren't born yet, I know. But for those of us, some of us wish we were back there in the 70s, probably. And as I said, this was a study that really did focus on curriculum matters. So Jack actually was pioneering a methodological approach that was a survey-based approach called Prospective Discrepancy Assessment, in which he looked at the different points of view of everybody in the situation and tried to understand where the gaps were and how to move things forwards. And he was very interested in what the curriculum looked like. But as we move forward in the study, and this was very pronounced in the California piece, it was very clear that these women couldn't identify and look into themselves unless they had a lot of social support. And social support, higher education isn't necessarily known for providing a lot of social support, right? But in fact, these programs pioneered because a good base of what they did was to be able to provide kind of cushioning for women in a tough love sort of fashion that enabled them to really identify, to look into themselves and rethink a lot of the places they've been and where they wanted to go. I think it's important to note that there was not one uniform community college nor one uniform women's program. And so we often think about this, people who follow in this footsteps, as thinking of middle-class, perhaps white women who were reading Betty Friedan and who needed to move into some other areas in their lives and wanted to rethink some of what they were doing and who they were. But in fact, there were many people from many different cultures and classes in these programs. And so the story that comes out of this, which is somewhat uniformly told in this little booklet, is actually more complicated if you begin to look at the field notes. One of the things that it does say in the report is kind of the germ or the basis for prospective transformation. And for those of you who are familiar with it, it is a process of looking into yourself and examining assumptions that you took for granted in light of the social expectations and critically looking at those, and then making decisions for yourself based on a reassessment, if you would, of yourself. It involves perspective taking, trying on different roles, and integration in a new role in life. But of course, you can't do that if you're a woman who's changing your role in society. And so it also involved reaching into the community and helping women move forward in that way as well. So what was really the strong point in this study was the focus on agency and self-confidence. Uniformly across the programs, that is what they emphasized. But they also focused to some extent, and Jack really pointed this out, on consciousness raising. In fact, Jack thought that that was one of the key contributions of his study, although that's not what he's normally remembered for. In fact, he's usually criticized for not bringing enough of the women's consciousness raising perspective into his study, but it's there. If you go back and read it, you'll find it. The other thing, of course, is that his theory is often known and criticized for being very individualistic and very cognitive, and it is. But it's also true that in that early study, there was a lot of emphasis on social support, modeling, likening of administrators to women so that they didn't feel the social distance or power distance, graduates who came back who provided mentoring. Okay, she's going to cut me off. I just want to add this one piece, which has to do with consciousness raising, because Jack could see that this contribution of these programs was really to help raise women's consciousness. But there was actually a very mixed picture in the community colleges. And so you'll see from the quote up there, and there are other ones much like it, that some people felt that women weren't ready for this kind of role, and they probably weren't. They might have been ready for it, but their families or their communities were not. And so there was this question of back and forth of how do you help women move and be more themselves, but also to keep in consciousness the role of society and how much they could challenge it at that point. So I'm going to stop, because I've been told to, and pass this on to Ted Fleming, who takes the theory in a somewhat different direction, drawing on Axel Honneth and recognition theory.